Hey folks, this is Kelani. As Battle for Azeroth looms closer and closer, it looks like everything is coming together quite nicely on the beta. We're still a couple months out, but a good chunk of that time will probably be spent during the pre-patch event. Remember that Legion had a 6 weeks pre-patch instead of the usual 4, so we could see the pre-patch hit live servers as early as July 3rd, which really isn't that far away. I think the key here is going to be the Mage Tower, because the dev team have said that the Mage Tower will become active permanently leading up to the release of Battle for Azeroth, so everyone can get a few extra chances to pick up their Mage Tower appearances. When that happens, you know we're super close. With us being so close, it makes you wonder how much else could really change before we're stomping through the new questing zones of Zandalar and Kulturas, which might worry a few people. Most of the content seems to be in place right now. We've been able to test the full Warfront cycle, island expeditions are way more polished than they were when we first got to test them, raid testing has been underway, and Mythic Plus was finally unlocked for testing, where a few people found some interesting changes to the hugely popular dungeon system, so let's have a chat about that. Going into Battle for Azeroth will change Mythic Plus in a few ways, the first being that you will no longer be able to change any gear after the key has been activated. So when the timer starts, that's it, your gear set is locked in for the entire dungeon. That might seem like a natural progression of the system, we're already unable to change our talents after a Mythic Plus dungeon starts, so does it really matter that much if we can't change our gear either? It might have some interesting implications. In Battle for Azeroth it could either be a lot worse, or a lot better having the option to change your gear throughout your dungeon. We no longer have the legendary system, so we don't have high-powered abilities or effects tied to very specific gear slots with a restriction on how many pieces we can use at once. If you want to change your AoE legendaries for trash and swap back to single-target legendaries for bosses, that can be incredibly powerful and increase the rate at which you can plow through your Mythic Plus dungeon. But you can't just swap those pieces most of the time, you have to have a few extra pieces in your bags to allow you to swap a head legendary for a wrist legendary, a ring legendary for a trinket, so you need to have quite a few extra pieces of gear in your bags to be able to swap any legendaries around. Now you can argue that we have the Azerite armor, which works in a similar sort of way. They're powerful pieces of equipment in a specific slot which are supposed to have quite an impact on our gameplay. Well, they're very specifically head, shoulder and chest slot items. You can swap them out without having to rejig your other pieces of gear. That makes it a lot easier to swap around your Azerite traits, but the power you get from Azerite armor can't really hold a candle to legendary items from Legion. Some of the bonuses are nice, but a lot of it is minor stuff. The min-maxes out there will still probably want to swap around Azerite armor to have the best pieces of gear for every single situation, which is probably one of the reasons why this restriction is being implemented, but honestly you'd probably get more from swapping around your trinkets, which is another problem by itself. So I guess one of the questions I would have is, if the power potential of swapping around your gear is lessened quite significantly because we no longer have legendaries, is this change really needed? The dev team probably just doesn't want you running around looking for every piece of gear there is, just so you can have every available Azerite trait or trinket to switch things up on the go to have the absolute best loadout for every trash pack or every boss in a specific dungeon. That's a lot of extra gear, so from that point of view I can see how this could be a great change. Instead of having to look at every trash pack and every boss individually, you have to take the whole picture into account and decide what's going to carry you through to the end with the highest chance of success. Personally, I actually prefer this method. You have to weigh a lot of options up when deciding which pieces of gear to equip if you're heading into high level Mythic Plus. If one boss is a DPS race but one boss requires a certain amount of survivability, you're going to have to balance those two bosses against each other and overcome those challenges with a single set of gear, instead of having one set of gear for every DPS race and one set of gear for everything that requires a bit of survivability, and then another set to plow through all of the trash. Looking at the entire dungeon as a whole could be an interesting change. Obviously, we might end up with gear sets tailored very specifically for dungeons themselves instead of scenarios we might encounter inside dungeons, but I think that's still a little more fun. The most immediate problem I see with this change is if you ever hit a wall in your Mythic Plus dungeon, no matter who you are or what level of key you're running, if you hit a wall on a specific boss you can't try to change things up on the fly. You'll have to leave the instance, which would put your timer further behind. You could argue that if you're hitting a wall, your key is probably going to time out anyway, so taking a few minutes to change talents or gear isn't going to make much of a difference, but it's going to be interesting to see how it all ends up. Another issue is forgetting to equip the appropriate items before the dungeon starts. If you've just been fishing, the dreaded fishing pole DPS might rear its ugly head again, or if you forget a specific trinket, etc, etc. But honestly, if you're not taking a minute or two before the dungeon starts to make sure you have everything you want equipped in their appropriate slots, well, you probably deserve to lose the minute or so off your timer. but perhaps the largest complaint I've seen regarding these changes comes down to class balance. Some classes just don't have the means to survive certain hits at high enough keys right now, while other classes don't have to sacrifice anything at all to happily laugh through the pain. If all of your choices are locked in at the start of a dungeon, classes with inherently better survivability will have a huge advantage because they won't have to trade out as much DPS for the survivability checks. Classes with immunities and high damage reduction cooldowns will be favoured as you get higher and higher up the system. You can see this already in Legion, and that's before we have the gear lock implemented. Some classes are having to run around with tank trinkets in some dungeons because they just can't survive some of the unavoidable damage without them. That's actually quite a big problem because you can't get a tank trinket unless you're a tank. If you don't have a tank spec, the only way for you to obtain those trinkets is for a tank friend to give them to you. That shouldn't ever be a thing in my opinion, and hopefully these changes will somewhat address that without completely devaluing the classes that were relying on it, but that comes down to class balance more than anything else. Honestly, I don't think this change will affect 95% of players running Mythic Plus in any meaningful way, and in some ways it could give the players at the lower end of things a bit more to think about, which could end up being more fun, but the chaps at the tippy top of Mythic Plus progression will feel this pretty hard. But when you think about it, having to wear the same set of gear throughout an entire dungeon also takes away the potential to cheese specific sections or encounters with a quick gear swap, making victory in the highest keys even more prestigious. It could be a really good thing long term, though I think we'll end up hitting walls with scaling much sooner than before. If something is unavoidable and one-shots you, that's kind of hard to overcome without tailoring your entire gear set around that one ability. If that means dropping a bunch of damage, but there's another boss in that dungeon which is a DPS check, you might have just hit your limit for now. I think that again comes down to balance and scaling, this time of the dungeons instead of the classes. I have my fingers crossed that this works out overall, but the ball is in Blizzard's court to make sure balancing and tuning aren't completely disastrous. As someone who plans to take Mythic Plus very seriously this time around, I'm really excited to play around with gear while taking an entire dungeon into consideration. There's also changes to the way affixes are going to work. Fortified and Tyrannical are now active from level 2, which means you will always have one of these abilities on every key you do, but that doesn't take away from the other affixes. You'll still have 3 others for a total of 4 possible affixes on keys above level 10. The next 2 are from a pool of random affixes, just like how they worked throughout Legion, Sanguine, Volcanic, Necrotic, those type of affixes, and then at level 10 and higher we have a seasonal affix. The first one we have is Infested, themed after the blood god Cahoon, so it's not crazy to assume that as we progress through the story in Battle for Azeroth and unlock new raid content, those seasonal affixes will change and will most likely be themed after the big bad we're currently confronting. So think Gul'dan, Kil'jaeden, and Argus if this were to apply for Legion content. The Infested affix will be active every week for keys higher than 10 while that specific season lasts. Infested causes several mobs throughout the dungeon to be infected with a parasite, which makes them resistant to CC, deal extra damage, and have more health. When those mobs die, the parasite tries to infect another mob, so you want to CC and try to kill it before that happens. I'm curious to see what other seasonal affixes we'll get throughout BFA. That's definitely going to change things up throughout the expansion. You might be thinking, it's alright, we still have a little bit of time before the game goes live, we could still see some meaningful changes by the time beta is over, right? Well, apparently not. The beta is more or less done from the sounds of things. Classes shouldn't see any more huge overhauls, and we've finally gotten around to the numbers tuning and balancing. So if you're not happy with the way your class currently looks on the beta, I wouldn't hold out much hope that things will change anytime soon. Ian did specifically mention that Enhancement and Elemental Shamans, as well as Shadow Priests, will receive some changes in the first patch of Battle for Azeroth, patch 8.1, so there's hope for those specs just over the horizon. Anyone else might have to wait quite a bit longer. That probably goes for any huge system changes as well, so the way Mythic Plus dungeons are working, as well as Warfronts and Island Expeditions, is probably a really good reflection of how they'll work when the game goes live. Beta is pretty much done content-wise at this point, I think. If you don't quite realise just how close we are to this whole chapter coming to a close, the pre-patch event and patch 8.0 is actually up on the PTR right now, so you don't even need beta to check out some of the changes coming in Battle for Azeroth. The PTR currently has pretty much everything implemented besides the new content of Zandalar and Kul Tiras, including class changes, the item level squish, the new community system, and even disabled artifact traits. So if you don't have beta but want to check out a few of the changes, you might want to get started on that PTR update. If you do head on over to the PTR, be aware that only a few of the servers have character copy available, so if you don't see the option, just swap around your server until the magic button appears. So a few changes to Mythic Plus, the beta is probably just about done, and patch 8.0 is finally up on the PTR. We're getting so close. What do you guys think think of the changes to gear swapping in Mythic Plus? What about the new affixes coming into play? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. If you want to hop on that train and see what it's all about, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.